Star Wars has always been a story about cycles. Republics rise, empires fall, rebellions spark, and then the cycle begins again. The galaxy never really learns its lessons, and that is what makes it both frustrating and fascinating. Because even when you think tyranny is gone, even when you watch the Emperor die and the Death Star explode, you can't shake the feeling that the shadow still lingers. The Empire looks finished after Endor. Palpatine was gone, Vader was redeemed, and the rebels had their victory dance with the Ewoks. But anyone who has watched Star Wars beyond that moment knows the truth. The Empire never truly vanished, it scattered into pieces. And those pieces didn't dissolve, they sharpened themselves into something waiting for its chance to rise again. We see it in The Mandalorian, with warlords hoarding fleets and stormtroopers still fighting like the war never ended. We see it in Ahsoka, with whispers of Thrawn waiting in the wings. And of course we saw it in the sequels, where the First Order took the ashes of the Empire and built something even more ruthless. Star Wars is reminding us that empires don't disappear, they evolve. The scary part is that this mirrors real history. Dictatorships fall, but leave behind networks of loyalists, propaganda, and resentment that can be reignited. Star Wars captures that cycle in a way that feels eerily familiar. It shows us that when people crave stability more than freedom, they are willing to invite tyranny right back into their homes. That is why the Empire's story is never really over. And that is what makes the question so interesting. Could the Empire rise again? Not just as remnants or warlords, but as a true empire that spans the stars once more. The pieces are all there, the failures of the New Republic, the loyalty of surviving Imperials, and the constant human temptation to trade liberty for order. If history is any guide, the answer is not just maybe, it is probably. In this video we are going to break down whether the Empire could ever rise again in Star Wars, how it already mutated into the First Order, what it might look like if it returned in full force, and why the saga keeps warning us that the fight against tyranny never really ends. When the Death Star exploded over Endor and Palpatine was thrown down a reactor shaft, it looked like the Empire was finished. The rebels cheered, fireworks lit up the skies, and the Ewoks played the drums on stormtrooper helmets. But as Star Wars keeps reminding us, the fall of an empire is rarely the end of tyranny. The New Republic was born, but the galaxy didn't magically transform into a stable utopia. Instead, old habits, old enemies, and old scars made sure the shadow of the Empire never truly went away. The first question is whether the Empire could actually rise again in a galaxy that watched it collapse twice. And the answer depends on what we mean by rise. A carbon copy of the old Empire, with Palpatine on the throne, is unlikely, because lightning doesn't strike in the same way twice. But fragments of that system, pieces of its ideology, and leaders still hungry for control have always lingered in the background. Even in Return of the Jedi, the final victory wasn't a clean sweep. It was just the beginning of a long process. Take The Mandalorian as an example. Years after Endor, warlords and remnants were still clinging to power. Moff Gideon's fleet, the Shadow Council, and scattered stormtroopers all show how difficult it is to kill an empire that spanned a galaxy. You can destroy the throne, but loyalists remain, and many of them were waiting for their chance to regroup. That is the uncomfortable truth about authoritarian regimes. They rarely vanish overnight. They go underground. The collapse of the New Republic only made things easier. The government that was supposed to replace the empire was riddled with incompetence, bureaucracy, and corruption. Mon Mothma's demilitarization policy left them unable to respond to threats effectively, creating a power vacuum. And history teaches us that power vacuums always invite opportunists. Warlords filled the gaps, pirates ran unchecked, and suddenly the chaos of the Republic made the order of the Empire look appealing again. That is the key factor: nostalgia. For many citizens who lived under imperial rule, life might have been strict, but it was also stable. Trains ran on time, smugglers were kept in check, and bandits feared the Empire. When the New Republic failed to maintain that order, it gave the remaining Imperials an opening to pitch themselves as the better option. Fear wasn't the only tool, order was too. And for regular people caught between lawless pirates and squabbling senators, order sounded tempting. It is also worth noting how deeply imperial propaganda had rooted itself. For years, citizens were told the empire was the only thing standing between them and chaos. When chaos arrived in the form of a weak republic, that message suddenly didn't sound so wrong. Palpatine may have been dead, but his ideology lived on, carried by moffs, governors, and military officers who genuinely believed the empire had been right all along. And let's not forget the military structure that survived. Fleets don't disappear just because the emperor does. Shipyards, factories, and officers loyal to the empire were scattered across the galaxy. Many went rogue, carving out their own territories. Others bided their time, waiting for the political winds to shift. If the right leader emerged to unify them, the empire's skeleton could easily be fleshed out into something new. The second angle to consider is the psychology of power and why empires so often resurface after collapse. Human history shows us that authoritarian regimes don't just disappear when toppled. The ideas, structures, and loyalists that supported them often adapt, rebrand, and re-emerge. Star Wars reflects this pattern perfectly through the rise of the First Order. It wasn't a random new villain, it was a direct continuation of Imperial remnants finding new ways to survive. The First Order emerged from the unknown regions, forged by Imperial officers who refused to accept defeat. They regrouped, rebuilt, and created a leaner, more fanatical version of the Empire. They learned from Palpatine's mistakes but carried over his obsession with fear and control. That is why they built Starkiller Base, an even bigger Death Star, because the Empire's ideology had always been rooted in intimidation through spectacle. The First Order wasn't proof that the Empire was gone, it was proof that its DNA had mutated and resurfaced. This pattern isn't unique to Star Wars. In our own world, defeated regimes have often returned in new forms, carried by loyalists who frame themselves as the solution to chaos. Star Wars mirrors this by showing that the New Republic's failures created fertile ground for old enemies. It is not just that remnants survived, it is that citizens allowed them to grow again because the alternative felt worse. Oppression feels tolerable when compared to anarchy. Characters like Gideon highlight this psychology. He wasn't just a man holding on to power, he was a true believer in the imperial cause. He saw the New Republic as weak and incapable, and in his mind the Empire's return was both inevitable and necessary. That blend of fanaticism and pragmatism is exactly what makes authoritarian movements so difficult to kill. They don't rely on one leader, they rely on belief. The Jedi and the rebels might have destroyed the figurehead, but they didn't destroy the belief system. And belief systems are harder to kill than people. This is why stormtroopers could still rally under new banners decades later, why governors still clung to authority, and why officers were willing to serve any leader who promised order. Star Wars is teaching us that tyranny isn't just about individuals, it is about institutions and culture. At the same time, the arrogance of imperial ideology remained its Achilles heel. Just like Palpatine, the First Order underestimated the resilience of ordinary people. Rey, Finn, and Poe weren't meant to be legendary heroes. They were meant to represent the fact that even small sparks of resistance can undo massive machines of control. The Empire rose again in a new form, but it carried the same flaws that doomed it the first time. It is also important to recognize the role of fear in making this cycle possible. Citizens often prefer the devil they know to the chaos they don't. The Empire understood that, which is why it marketed itself as the bringer of stability. The First Order exploited the same fear decades later, proving that authoritarian regimes thrive not because they are strong, but because they prey on weakness and uncertainty. The third angle is to look at the future of Star Wars and ask what another empire might actually look like. The sequel trilogy already gave us one version with the First Order, but the franchise keeps hinting that remnants of the Empire are still out there. The Mandalorian, Ahsoka, and other shows tease a galaxy where Imperial loyalists are not just surviving, but actively plotting a comeback. Which begs the question, could we see a true Second Empire rise in the future canon? If it did, it probably wouldn't look like Palpatine's empire. The days of one supreme ruler on a throne might be over, at least for now. Instead, a council of warlords, governors, and military leaders could emerge, creating something closer to an oligarchy. We've already seen this with the Shadow Council, a group of imperial leaders working in secret to rebuild. The seeds are already there, and Star Wars is careful to show us how dangerous those seeds could become. The difference is that this new empire would likely be more pragmatic. Palpatine's obsession with giant superweapons failed twice, so a smarter leadership might abandon the Death Star strategy in favour of fleets, technology, and political subversion. Think less about building one planet killer, and more about infiltrating governments, sabotaging the Republic, and presenting themselves as the only option for order. That is how authoritarian regimes thrive, by convincing people they are the solution to the very chaos they create. It is also possible that a future empire could use clones again. The Bad Batch hinted at the Empire experimenting with cloning technology, and Palpatine's obsession with immortality suggests that science was always part of the plan. Imagine an empire built not on stormtroopers, but on genetically engineered soldiers designed to be loyal and adaptable. That would fix the biggest weakness of the old stormtrooper model and create a new generation of enforcers. But even if this new empire looked smarter on the outside, it would still carry the same fatal flaws. Authoritarian systems rely on fear, and fear always decays. Leaders grow paranoid, citizens grow restless, and corruption eats away from within. Star Wars has hammered this point home across every trilogy. No matter how strong an empire looks, it will eventually collapse because it cannot sustain itself. The interesting part is how fans would respond. The Empire is iconic, the Stormtroopers and Star Destroyers are burned into pop culture. If Star Wars brings it back again, fans will cheer for the aesthetic, but also recognise the tragic cycle. The story would become less about heroes defeating villains, and more about societies failing to learn from their past. That is both exciting and terrifying. This is why the question matters. Can the Empire rise again? The answer is yes, but the bigger question is whether the galaxy would allow it. If history repeats itself, then the New Republic's failures could easily lead to another authoritarian revival. And if that happens, Star Wars will once again show us that the fight against tyranny is never truly finished. So the Empire's future is not about whether it can return, but what form it will take. The galaxy is too chaotic, too fragile, and too tempted by order for the idea to ever die, and that makes the possibility of another empire not just a narrative choice, but almost an inevitability.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.